The neon-lit streets of New Detroit pulsed with a restless energy that never slept. Outside Zane Carver's penthouse window, the city sprawled like a beast of steel and glass. Dealers shouting their wares in the shadows, engines snarling through the humid night air, and the occasional crack of gunfire slicing through the chaos. It was past midnight, the witching hour for men like Zane, who ruled this concrete jungle with a fist of iron and a smile that could charm the devil himself. Inside his fortress of luxury, perched 30 floors above the madness, the air was thick with the scent of whiskey and leather. Zane slouched in his oversized chair, one leg kicked over the armrest, a half-empty bottle dangling from his tattooed fingers. His sharp jaw clenched as he scrolled through encrypted messages on his hollow pad. Drug deals to broker, rivals to bury, debts to collect. He was a kingpin, a predator in a tailored black shirt unbuttoned just enough to show the ink snaking across his chest. His dark hair fell messily over his forehead, and his hazel eyes glinted with the kind of danger that made people either run or beg for mercy. He smirked to himself, savoring the quiet before his next move. Control was his drug, and tonight he was high on it. The penthouse was his sanctuary, a sleek, dimly lit cave of polished floors, black furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city like a trophy. The only sounds were the faint hum of his tech and the distant rumble of New Detroit below. He took a swig of whiskey, letting the burns settle in his throat, when a sudden flicker caught his eye, a pulse of electric blue light shimmering in the corner of the room. His hand shot to the pistol tucked under his desk, fingers curling around the grip with practiced ease. "Who's there?" he growled, his voice low and lethal, the kind that promised pain if he didn't like the answer. Before he could aim, the light solidified into a figure. She stood there, tall and impossibly sensual, materializing out of thin air like some fevered dream conjured by the whiskey. Her skin shimmered with an otherworldly glow, shifting from deep indigo to a soft silver under the penthouse's dim lighting. Long, flowing hair cascaded down her back, catching the neon glow like liquid starlight, and her body was wrapped in a form-fitting suit that hugged every curve, hips that swayed with an effortless grace, thighs that looked strong enough to crush a man, and an ass that demanded attention without even trying. Her face was a masterpiece, full lips parted slightly, high cheekbones catching the light, and eyes, huge, glowing orbs of violet, that locked onto him with an intensity that hit him like a physical blow. Two slender antennae peeked from her hair, twitching faintly as she scanned the room, adding a strange, alien allure to her already hypnotic presence. Zane's smirk vanished, replaced by a scowl that could curdle blood. "Who the hell are you? And how do you get past my security?" He stood, towering over the desk, his pistol now in hand but not yet raised. His tone was a blade, sharp and cold, the kind that usually sent underlings scrambling or enemies to their knees. He wasn't used to being caught off guard, not in his own damn house. The woman tilted her head, her violet eyes narrowing as if she were dissecting him. She stepped closer, too close, her bare feet silent on the polished floor. "Human," she said, her voice a sultry hum that vibrated through the air, wrapping around him like a caress. "I am Lyra, from the planet Vyxara. I am here to study your species' physical responses." Her lips curled into a faint, curious smile, and before Zane could process her words, her hand darted out. Long, delicate fingers brushed the inside of his thigh, the heat of her touch searing through his jeans like a live wire. Zane jolted, his body reacting before his brain could catch up. "Hey, princess," he snarled, grabbing her wrist and yanking it away. "You don't touch what's mine without permission." His grip was iron, his hazel eyes flashing with a mix of anger and something darker, something he'd never admit was interest. Up close, she smelled faintly of ozone and something sweet, like a storm laced with honey. Her skin was warm under his fingers, almost electric, and he felt a shiver crawl up his spine. Lyra didn't flinch. Her glowing eyes flicked downward, where his jeans tightened traitorously against his will. That faint smile widened, and her free hand hovered near his hip, fingers tracing the air just above his belt. "Fascinating," she murmured, her voice dripping with a clinical curiosity that somehow made it sexier. "Your anatomy responds rapidly to external stimuli. Is this a mating signal?" Her antennae twitched, and she leaned in, her face inches from his, her breath brushing his cheek. Zane's grip on her wrist tightened, but the whiskey and her damn proximity dulled his usual edge. He barked a rough laugh, shoving her hand away and stepping back to regain control. "Lady, you're about 2 seconds from finding out what happens when you mess with me." His tone was a threat, but his eyes betrayed him, lingering on the curve of her neck where her skin shimmered like liquid metal, then dipping to the way her suit clung to her hips. He wasn't blind. She was a walking temptation, alien or not. She pulled back slightly, her head tilting again as if she were filing away his reaction. "I intend no harm, Zane Carver," she said, her voice still that maddening hum. "My research requires interaction." Without warning, her hand shot out again, this time landing on his jaw. Her fingers traced the stubble there, slow and deliberate, then slid down to his neck, brushing the pulse point just below his ear. Zane froze, a shiver ripping through him that he couldn't suppress. "Your aggression is noted," she continued, her thumb grazing his lower lip. "Does it heighten your arousal?" He swatted her hand away, his laugh darker this time, edged with something raw. "You're insane, and way too bold for someone who just broke into my place." He stepped forward, using his height to loom over her, his broad shoulders casting a shadow across her shimmering form. Most people shrank under his glare, but Lyra just stared up at him, unfazed, her lips dangerously close to his. He could feel the heat radiating off her, smell that ozone and honey scent, and it took every ounce of willpower not to close the gap. "I require data," she said, pressing a hand to his chest. Her fingers slid lower, brushing the hard lines of his abs through his shirt, then resting on his hip bone. "Your form is optimal for study." Her touch lingered, her nails grazing the skin just above his waistband, and Zane felt his breath hitch despite himself. He smirked, flipping the script. "You want to play, sweetheart? Fine, but I don't do free shows." In one swift move, he grabbed her waist, pulling her flush against him. His hands settled on the curve of her hips, thumbs digging into the soft flesh there, and he felt her body tense, a crack in her cool, alien facade. Her ass pressed against his thighs as he held her, and he couldn't resist sliding one hand lower, giving a light squeeze. "How's that for data?" he muttered, his voice a husky growl. Lyra's eyes widened, her breath catching audibly. "This physical proximity," she said, her voice trembling just enough to send a jolt through him. "It accelerates your pulse." Her hand slid up his arm, fingers brushing the top muscle of his bicep, then tracing the line of his collarbone to his neck. She paused there, her fingertips pressing against his pulse, then slid higher, brushing his lips. "Does this please you?" Zane leaned in, his mouth hovering over hers, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Keep going, and you'll find out." His hand tightened on her hip, the other sliding up her back to rest just below her shoulder blades. Her skin buzzed under his touch, warm and electric, and he felt her lean into him. Whether by instinct or curiosity, he didn't care. For a moment, the room shrank to just the two of them, the kingpin and the alien, locked in a game neither had expected. But then she pulled back, her antennae twitching violently. A sleek device materialized in her hand, a holographic tablet that floated beside her, glowing with strange symbols. "Initial contact recorded," she said, her voice steadying as she tapped the screen. "Subject exhibits heightened aggression and involuntary physical response." Her eyes flicked to his jeans again, and Zane groaned, running a hand through his hair. "You've got some nerve," he muttered, stepping back to pour himself another shot of whiskey. He downed it in one gulp, the burn grounding him. "What's your deal, Lyra? You teleport into my house, start groping me, and now you're taking notes like I'm some lab rat." She tilted her head, her tablet humming softly. "You are not a rodent, Zane Carver." You're my primary subject. Vyxaran science demands precision. Her hand hovered near his arm again, as if tempted to touch, but she hesitated, a first for her. Your resistance is unexpected. Most species welcome observation. Yeah, well, I'm not most species, he snapped, slamming the glass down. He crossed the room to her in 2 strides, grabbing her chin and tilting her face up. And I don't like being watched. His thumb brushed her cheek, then slid to her lips, parting them slightly. Her breath hitched again, and he smirked. Unless it's mutual. Lyra's violet eyes flickered, her tablet beeping faintly. Mutual observation, she repeated, as if testing the idea. Her hand landed on his chest again, fingers splaying across his shirt, then sliding down to his hip. I will adjust my approach. Tell me, Zane Carver, how do humans negotiate such interactions? He chuckled, low and rough, releasing her chin but not stepping back. Negotiate? Babe, we don't negotiate. We take. He grabbed her waist again, spinning her so her back pressed against his chest. His hands roamed her hips, then slid up her sides, brushing the edges of her ribs. And right now you're on my turf. My rules. She didn't resist, but her voice held a trace of defiance. Your rules are primitive, but intriguing. Her head tilted back, exposing her neck, and Zane's fingers twitched with the urge to touch it, to taste it. Instead, he let his hands settle on her thighs, squeezing lightly as he leaned down, his lips brushing her ear. Primitive works for me, he whispered. Let's see how long you last, princess. The night stretched ahead, a collision of human grit and alien curiosity, and Zane knew one thing for sure. This wasn't ending anytime soon. And that's just the start of this wild ride. Want to see how Zane handles this glowy alien intruder? Smash that subscribe button below and join the crew. We've got more steamy sci-fi chaos coming your way. Don't miss it. The air in Zane Carver's penthouse hung heavy with tension, the kind that crackled like static before a storm. The neon glow from New Detroit's skyline bled through the tinted windows, casting jagged streaks of pink and blue across the polished floors. Zane leaned against his desk, arms crossed over his broad chest, the black shirt clinging to his frame, still unbuttoned just enough to tease the tattoos curling across his skin. His hazel eyes narrowed as he watched Lyra, the alien intruder who'd turned his night upside down. She stood a few feet away, her shimmering form a stark contrast to the gritty luxury of his world. Indigo skin catching the light, hair flowing like molten silver, and those damn violet eyes that seemed to see straight through him. Her presence was a challenge, and Zane didn't back down from challenges. Lyra didn't retreat from his glare. Instead, she stepped closer, her movements fluid, almost predatory in their grace. Your resistance is unproductive, she said, her sultry voice humming through the room like a siren's call. She held up her hand, and that sleek holographic tablet materialized again, floating beside her with a faint buzz. She tapped it once, and Zane felt a subtle shift in the air, a low hum that made the hairs on his neck stand up. What the hell's that? He demanded, his tone sharp, one hand twitching toward the pistol still tucked under the desk. An observation tool, she replied, her lips curving into that faint, infuriating smile. It records physiological shifts. Her eyes flicked downward, lingering on the tight stretch of his jeans where her earlier touch had left its mark. Your heart rate increased 17% when I touched your face. Her hand darted out again, brushing his cheek with a feather-light stroke, then sliding down to his jaw. Her fingers lingered there, tracing the stubble, and Zane felt a jolt shoot straight to his core. And your pupils dilated when my hand was here. She moved lower, her fingers grazing his thigh, then sliding up to his hip bone, nails skimming the edge of his belt. Zane caught her wrist mid-motion, his grip firm, but not bruising. Your tease, huh? His smirk was dark, dangerous, the kind he used to bend people to his will. He yanked her closer, spinning her so her back pressed against the desk. His hands gripped her hips, thumbs digging into the soft curve there, and he felt her body shift, her ass brushing his thighs as she adjusted. Fine, let's see how you like it. He leaned in, his chest pressing against her back, one hand sliding lower to give her ass a light, possessive squeeze. Her suit was thin, almost like a second skin, and the heat of her body radiated through it, tempting him to push further. Lyra gasped, a soft, involuntary sound that hit him like a shot of adrenaline. "This aggression," she said, her voice trembling just enough to betray her cool facade. "It triggers a response in me as well." Curious. Her head tilted back, exposing the long, shimmering line of her neck, and Zane's fingers twitched with the urge to trace it. He could see her pulse fluttering under her skin, a faint silver flush creeping up her cheeks. She turned in his grip, facing him now, her hands landing on his chest. Her fingers dug in slightly, nails pressing through his shirt, and she pressed her thigh against his, the contact sending a fresh wave of heat through him. "This contact, it's reciprocal," she murmured, her lips grazing his jaw as she spoke. "My sensors detect heightened blood flow in both of us." "Is this how humans negotiate intimacy?" Zane chuckled, low and rough, his hands still locked on her hips. "Negotiate? Nah, babe. This is how we take what we want." He tilted her chin up with one hand, his thumb brushing her bottom lip, parting it slightly. Her breath was warm against his skin, her eyes half-lidded, and for a moment, he forgot she wasn't human, forgot everything but the way her body felt pressed against his. He leaned in closer, his lips hovering over hers, daring her to make the next move. "You gonna keep playing scientist? Or are you gonna play with me?" Her antennae twitched violently, and she pulled back just enough to break the spell. The hollow tablet beeped, snapping Zane out of his haze. Lyra blinked, stepping out of his grasp, though her hands lingered on his arms, tracing the taut muscle there. "Data collected," she said, her voice steadying as she tapped the screen. "Your dominance display is stimulating. I must explore further." The tablet hummed again, and a faint projection flickered in the air, graphs and numbers that meant nothing to Zane but clearly fascinated her. "Explore." He raised a brow, leaning back against the desk, arms crossed again. "You're not planting cameras in my place, are you?" His tone was half joking, half warning, but the way her eyes darted to the side told him everything. He groaned, running a hand through his hair, the tousled strands falling back over his forehead. "You're a real piece of work, Lyra." "Fine. You want to study me? You play by my rules." He grabbed her wrist again, pulling her back into his space. His hand slid down her back, resting just above her ass, fingers brushing the base of her spine. "Rule 1. No sneaking around. You touch me, you ask first." He tapped her cheek with his free hand, a wicked grin spreading across his face. "Got it." She nodded, her lips parting as his fingers lingered on her spine. "Understood. And if I require contact for research?" Her voice was softer now, almost hesitant, and her hand slid up his arm again, brushing his neck, then resting on his collarbone. Her touch was electric, and Zane felt his pulse kick up despite his best efforts to stay in control. "Then you beg real nice," he said, his grin sharpening. He leaned down, his lips brushing her ear, his breath hot against her skin. "Say pretty please, Zane, and maybe I'll let you." His hand tightened on her waist, pulling her closer, and he felt her shiver, a small, delicious crack in her alien composure. Lyra's eyes flickered, her tablet forgotten for a moment. "Begging is inefficient," she said, but there was a trace of amusement in her tone. She pressed closer, her thighs sliding between his, her hands roaming up his chest to his shoulders. "But if it facilitates cooperation," her fingers brushed his neck again, then slid to his jaw, her thumb grazing his lips. "Pretty please, Zane. May I continue?" He barked a laugh, caught off guard by her playfulness. "Damn, you're quick." He grabbed her hips again, lifting her onto the desk in one smooth motion. She landed with a soft thud, her legs parting slightly, and Zane stepped between them, his hands settling on her thighs. He squeezed lightly, feeling the muscle tense under his touch, then slid his palms up to her hips. "All right, princess, you've got your pass, but don't think I'm letting you run this show." His fingers brushed the curve of her ass as he adjusted her position, pulling her flush against him. Lyra's breath hitched, her hands gripping his shoulders for balance. "Your control is compelling," she said, her voice unsteady. She leaned in, her lips brushing his cheek, then sliding to his jaw. "My data indicates a 23% increase in your respiratory rate, and my mirrors it." Her hands slid down his arms, fingers tracing the veins there, then back up to his neck. She pressed her thumb against his pulse, her eyes locked on his. "This is more complex than anticipated." "Complex?" Zane smirked, his hands roaming her sides now, brushing the edges of her ribs. "Babe, you've barely scratched the surface." He tilted her chin up again, his thumbs stroking her lower lip, then sliding to her cheek. Her skin was warm, buzzing faintly under his touch, and he felt her lean into it, a silent invitation. He leaned down, his lips grazing her neck, slow and deliberate, tasting the electric hum of her skin. She moaned softly, a sound that shot straight through him, and her hands tightened on his shoulders, nails digging in. The hollow tablet beeped again, louder this time, and Zane growled, pulling back. "That thing's starting to piss me off." He reached for it, but Lyra caught his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "It is necessary," she said, her voice firm despite the flush on her cheeks. "Without it, my research—" "Your research can wait," he interrupted, pinning her wrist to the desk. His other hand slid to her hip, squeezing possessively. "You want to play this game, Lyra? Then focus on me, not your damn gadget." He leaned in, his lips brushing her ear again. "Or I'll make you." Her antennae twitched, and she tilted her head, studying him. "You are unusually demanding," she said, but there was a spark in her eyes, something playful, almost human. She pressed her thigh against his again, her hands sliding down his chest to his abs, fingers brushing the skin just above his belt. "Very well. I will focus." Her lips grazed his jaw, then his neck, and Zane felt his control slipping inch by inch. "Good girl," he muttered, his voice rough. He grabbed her waist, pulling her off the desk and into his arms. Her legs wrapped around his hips instinctively, and he carried her to the couch, dropping her onto the leather with a smirk. She landed with a soft bounce, her hair fanning out, and Zane loomed over her, one knee between her thighs. "Let's see how much data you can handle." His hands slid up her thighs, squeezing the soft flesh there, then moved to her hips, thumbs brushing the sensitive skin just below her waistband. Lyra's breath quickened, her hands reaching for his chest again. "Your approach is unorthodox," she said, but her voice was shaky, her fingers trembling as they traced his collarbone. "Yet effective. My sensors indicate." "Screw your sensors." Zane cut in, leaning down until his lips were inches from hers. His hand slid to her ass, giving it a firm squeeze, and she arched into him, a soft whimper escaping her lips. "How's that feel, princess? Still want to take notes?" Her eyes fluttered shut, her hands gripping his shoulders. I may need to adjust my methodology," she whispered, her lips brushing his as she spoke. "This is overwhelming." Zane grinned, his hand sliding up her back to her neck, fingers tangling in her hair. "Welcome to my world, Lyra." He kissed her then, hard, hungry, but with a flicker of something softer, something he didn't want to name. She melted into it, her hands roaming his chest, his arms, his hips, and for the first time, Zane wondered if he was the one being studied, or the one being changed. The night stretched on, a tangled dance of control and surrender, and neither of them was backing down. Things are heating up, and trust me, you won't believe what's next for Zane and Lyra. Hit that subscribe button now, so you don't miss a single second of this badass saga. Let's keep the party going. The days bled into weeks, and Lyra became an unshakable fixture in Zane Carver's penthouse, a shimmering anomaly in his world of grit and steel. New Detroit's neon chaos thrummed outside the tinted windows, a constant reminder of the empire Zane ruled with an iron grip. But inside, the air was charged with something new. He sprawled on the black leather couch one evening, shirtless after a shower, droplets still clinging to the tattoos snaking across his chest and arms. His dark hair was damp, tousled over his forehead, and his hazel eyes glinted with a mix of irritation and amusement as he watched Lyra perch on the armrest. Her violet gaze locked on him like he was a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. Her indigo skin shimmered under the dim lights, her suit hugging every curve, hips that swayed when she moved, thighs that flexed with quiet strength, and an ass that Zane had to force himself not to stare at. Her antennae twitched faintly, a telltale sign she was analyzing him again. "You gonna keep staring, princess? Or are you gonna say something?" Zane's voice was a low growl, rough around the edges but laced with a teasing edge. He stretched his arms along the back of the couch, flexing his biceps just to see if she'd react. She did. Her eyes flicked to the ripple of muscle, her fingers twitching like she wanted to reach out. He smirked, leaning forward slightly. "What's the matter? Sensor's picking up something you like." Lyra tilted her head, her full lips parting as she slid off the armrest to sit beside him. Too close, as always. "Your musculature, it's aesthetically pleasing," she said, her voice that sultry hum that drove him crazy. Her hand hovered over his abs, then brushed them with a light, tentative touch, fingers tracing the hard lines there. She slid higher, her palm resting on his chest, then up to his collarbone, lingering where his pulse beat steadily under her fingertips. "Does this please you?" Her nails grazed his neck, sending a shiver down his spine, and Zane felt his breath catch despite himself. He grabbed her hand, pulling her onto his lap in one swift move. "You're learning, huh?" His hands settled on her hips, thumbs brushing the sensitive skin just above her waistband. She squirmed, her thighs pressing against his, and he felt her breath hitch as his fingers slid up her sides, stopping just short of her ribs. "What's your data say now?" His voice was husky, his smirk dark, but there was a flicker of something softer in his eyes, something he wasn't ready to name. Lyra's voice trembled, her hands gripping his shoulders. Elevated pulse, increased heat signatures. She leaned in, her lips brushing his cheek, then sliding to his jaw, her breath warm against his skin. "My own responses mirror yours. This confuses me." Her fingers traced his neck again, then brushed his lips, parting them slightly, and Zane felt a jolt shoot through him. Her antennae twitched violently, betraying her calm exterior, and he couldn't help but grin. "Confuses you?" He tilted her chin up, his thumb stroking her lower lip. "Welcome to being human, sweetheart." His hand slid to her neck, fingers tangling in her silvery hair, and he pulled her closer, his lips grazing the shimmering skin just below her ear. She moaned softly, a sound that hit him like a punch, and her hands tightened on his shoulders, nails digging in. He kissed her neck, slow, deliberate, tasting the electric hum of her skin, and felt her arch into him, her thighs squeezing his hips. The hollow tablet beeped from across the room, a shrill reminder of her damn research, and Zane growled, pulling back. "That thing again," he muttered, his hands still locked on her hips. He squeezed lightly, feeling her shift against him, her ass brushing his thighs in a way that made his pulse race. "You gonna let interrupt us every time? Or you gonna turn it off?" Lyra's eyes fluttered open, her cheeks flushed a deeper silver. "It records automatically," she said, her voice shaky. She reached for his chest again, fingers tracing the tattoos there, then sliding down to his abs. "But I can't adjust its priority." Her hand paused at his waistband, nails grazing the skin just above it, and Zane felt his control slip another notch. "Then adjust it," he said, his tone rough. He grabbed her waist, flipping her onto the couch beneath him in one smooth motion. She landed with a soft gasp, her hair fanning out across the leather, and Zane loomed over her, one knee between her thighs. His hand slid up her legs, squeezing the soft flesh of her thighs, then moved to her hips, thumbs brushing the curve there. "No more spying, Lyra. You want to feel something? Feel this." He leaned down, his lips brushing her neck again, then sliding to her collarbone. Her skin buzzed under his touch, warm and electric, and she arched into him, her hands roaming his back, fingers digging into his shoulders. "Zane," she whispered, her first time using his name like that, and it hit him harder than he expected. Her hand slid to his hips, pulling him closer, and he felt her thigh press against his, her breath quickening. "This exceeds my parameters," she said, her voice trembling, but there was a spark in her eyes, something hungry, almost human. He grinned, his hand sliding to her ass, giving a firm squeeze. "Good. Means I'm winning." He kissed her jaw, then her cheek, his lips hovering over hers. "You're not just a scientist, Lyra. Not with me." His fingers brushed her spine, then settled on her hips again, pulling her flush against him. She whimpered, a soft, desperate sound, and Zane felt something shift inside him. A crack in the armor he'd worn for years. But old habits died hard. The next morning, he caught her staring again, perched on the kitchen counter in nothing but that damn suit, her eyes locked on his bare back as he poured coffee. Scars crisscrossed his skin, souvenirs from a life of violence, and he felt her gaze like a physical touch. "Enjoying the view?" he asked, turning with a smirk, coffee mug in hand. He leaned against the counter, shirtless and unapologetic, his jeans slung low on his hips. Lyra slid off the counter, closing the distance between them. "Your scars, they tell a story," she said, her hand reaching out to brush one that curved across his shoulder. Her fingers traced it, slow and deliberate, then slid to his chest, resting over his heart. "Does this pain linger?" Her voice was softer now, less clinical, and her touch lingered on his neck, brushing the pulse there. Zane set the mug down, grabbing her wrist and pulling her closer. "Pain's just fuel, princess." His hands settled on her hips, thumbs brushing the skin just above her suit. "Keeps me sharp." He leaned in, his lips grazing her ear, then her neck, and she shivered, her hands sliding to his abs, fingers tracing the hard lines there. "You getting bold, huh? What's next? Gonna cop a feel while I'm sleeping?" Her antennae twitched, and she pressed closer, her thigh brushing his. "I considered it," she admitted, her lips grazing his jaw. "For research. But your rules." She paused, her hand sliding to his hip, nails grazing the skin just above his jeans. "I respect them." He chuckled, low and rough, his hand sliding to her ass, squeezing lightly. "Good girl. Keep that up, and I might let you break a few." He tilted her chin up, his thumb brushing her cheek, then her lips. "But don't think I'm going soft. I'm still the bad guy here." His tone was teasing, but there was a flicker of truth in it, a warning, maybe, or a plea. Lyra's eyes flickered, her hands roaming his chest again. "Bad, yet protective," she said, her voice steadying. She leaned in, her lips brushing his collarbone, then his neck. "Your aggression has layers. I find it compelling." Her fingers slid to his hips, pulling him closer, and Zane felt his pulse kick up, his hands tightening on her thighs. "Compelling." He smirked, lifting her onto the counter in one swift move. She gasped, her legs parting slightly, and he stepped between them, his hands sliding up her thighs to her hips. "You're starting to sound human, Lyra." His lips brushed her cheek, then her jaw, and she tilted her head back, exposing her neck. He kissed it, slow, hungry, tasting that electric hum again, and felt her hands grip his shoulders, nails digging in. "I adapt," she whispered, her breath quickening as his hands roamed her sides, brushing her ribs, then settling on her ass. "You influence me." Her lips grazed his ear, then his neck, and Zane felt a warmth spread through him. Something dangerous, something he couldn't control. "Careful," he muttered, his voice rough. "Influence goes both ways." He pulled back, grabbing her chin and tilting her face up. His thumb brushed her lips, parting them, and he kissed her, deep, possessive, but with a gentleness that surprised even him. She melted into it, her hands sliding to his hips, fingers digging into the skin there. And Zane knew he was in trouble. This wasn't just a game anymore. The shift crept up on him over the next few days. He'd catch himself watching her. When she bent over to adjust that damn tablet, her ass outlined perfectly in that suit. When she brushed past him, her hand accidentally grazing his thigh. He'd tease her, pulling her close, his hands roaming her hips or her back. But there was a hesitation now, a flicker of care he didn't want to admit. One night, As rain lashed the windows, he found her on the couch, her tablet silent for once. He sprawled beside her, shirtless again, as she pressed herself against him without a word, her hands resting on his chest. "You're quiet," he said, his hand sliding to her hip, thumb brushing the curve there. "No, data tonight?" She shook her head, her lips brushing his jaw. "I wanted this." Her hand slid to his neck, fingers tracing his pulse, then to his cheek. "You feel it too?" Her voice was soft, vulnerable, and Zane felt his chest tighten. "Yeah," he admitted, his hand sliding to her ass, pulling her closer. "I feel it." He kissed her neck, then her cheek, his lips hovering over hers. "Don't make me say it, though." His tone was teasing, but his eyes were serious, and Lyra smiled. A real, human smile. "I won't," she whispered, her hands roaming his chest, then his hips. "But I'll explore it." Her lips brushed his, soft and tentative, and Zane let her take the lead, for once, knowing he was already lost. The shift was real, and he couldn't fight it anymore. Whoa, did you feel that shift? Zane's not the same bad guy anymore, and Lyra's only getting started. Subscribe right now to catch every twist, twitch, and touch in this glowy adventure. Hit that button and stick with us for the wildest ride in the galaxy. The penthouse had become a battleground of sorts. Not the kind Zane Carver was used to, with blood and bullets, but a quieter, more dangerous one. Weeks had turned into months, and Lyra's presence had woven itself into the fabric of his life, a shimmering thread in the dark tapestry of New Detroit. The city still roared outside, neon lights flickering, engines growling, deals going down in the shadows, but inside the air was softer, warmer, charged with something Zane couldn't quite name. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows one evening, shirt unbuttoned, a glass of whiskey in hand as he watched the rain streak the glass. His tattoos gleamed under the dim lights, scars crisscrossing his skin like a map of his sins, and his hazel eyes were distant, lost in thought. Lyra emerged from the shadows, her indigo skin catching the neon glow, her suit clinging to every curve, hips that swayed with an effortless grace, thighs that flexed with quiet power, and an ass that still made Zane's pulse kick up despite his best efforts. Her silvery hair flowed down her back, and her violet eyes locked on him with that unnerving intensity. She'd changed since that first night, less clinical, more human, though her antennae still twitched when she was curious. And she was always curious about him. "You're brooding," she said, her voice a sultry hum as she crossed the room. She stopped beside him, her hand brushing his arm, fingers tracing the taut muscle there. "Your posture suggests conflict." Her touch slid to his chest, resting over his heart, then up to his neck, brushing the pulse point just below his ear. "Does this please you?" Zane smirked, setting the glass down on the windowsill. "You're getting good at this, princess." He grabbed her waist, pulling her flush against him, his hands settling on her hips. His thumbs brushed the sensitive skin just above her suit, and she shivered, her thighs pressing against his. "What's her data say now?" His voice was rough, teasing, but there was a warmth in it, a crack in the bad guy facade he'd worn like armor. Lyra's lips parted, her hands sliding to his abs, fingers tracing the hard lines there. Elevated pulse, increased heat signatures. She leaned in, her lips brushing his jaw, then his cheek, her breath warm against his skin. "But it's different now. Less aggression, more intent." Her fingers slid to his hips, nails grazing the skin just above his jeans, and Zane felt a jolt shoot through him. Her antennae twitched, betraying her calm exterior, and she pressed closer, her thigh brushing his. "You've changed, Zane Carver." He chuckled, low and rough, his hand sliding to her ass, giving a light squeeze. "Don't get ahead of yourself, babe. I'm still me." But his tone lacked its usual edge, and his other hand brushed her spine, fingers lingering at the base of her neck. He tilted her chin up, his thumb stroking her lower lip, parting it slightly. "Maybe you're just rubbing off on me." His lips grazed her neck, slow and deliberate, tasting the electric hum of her skin, and she moaned softly, her hands gripping his shoulders. "Rubbing off." Lyra's voice trembled, her hands roaming his chest again, then sliding to his hips. A human idiom. I influence you. She tilted her head back, exposing her neck, and Zane kissed it, hungry, possessive, but with a gentleness that surprised him. Her fingers dug into his skin, her breath quickening as she pressed her body against his, her ass brushing his thighs as she shifted. Yeah, he muttered, pulling back to look at her. His hand slid to her cheek, brushing the shimmering skin there, then to her lips. Don't make me spell it out, though. He kissed her, deep, slow, a collision of heat and something softer, and she melted into it, her hands sliding to his neck, fingers tangling in his hair. The rain pounded the windows, a steady rhythm that matched the thud of his pulse, and Zane felt the last of his walls crumbling. The shift wasn't sudden. It had been building, creeping up on him like a shadow. He still ran his empire, barking orders over encrypted lines, breaking jaws when deals went south, but Lyra's presence tempered him. She'd ask about his scars, her fingers tracing them with a tenderness he didn't deserve, her lips brushing his chest as she listened to his clipped answers. He'd catch himself explaining things, why he fought, why he ruled, while her hands rested on his hips or grazed his thighs, her touch a quiet anchor in his storm. One afternoon, as he cleaned a blade in the kitchen, she perched on the counter, watching him with those violet eyes. "Why do you keep these?" she asked, her hand brushing his arm, fingers sliding to his wrist. "Weapons, they're primitive." Her touch lingered, then moved to his chest, resting over his heart. "Yet you wield them with precision." Zane set the blade down, grabbing her waist and pulling her off the counter. "Precision keeps me alive, princess." His hands settled on her hips, thumbs brushing the curve there, and he leaned in, his lips grazing her ear. "And I'm damn good at it." His hand slid to her ass, squeezing lightly, and she gasped, her thighs pressing against his. "You want to see?" Lyra's antennae twitched, her hands sliding to his abs, fingers tracing the scars there. "I observe," she said, her voice shaky. She leaned in, her lips brushing his jaw, then his neck. "Your aggression, it's protective, not just destructive." Her fingers slid to his hips, pulling him closer, and Zane felt his breath hitch, his hands tightening on her thighs. "Protective, huh?" He smirked, lifting her back onto the counter. She landed with a soft thud, her legs parting slightly, and he stepped between them, his hands sliding up her thighs to her hips. "You're seeing things, Lyra." His lips brushed her cheek, then her neck, and she tilted her head back, exposing the shimmering skin there. He kissed it, slow, hungry, tasting that electric hum, and felt her hands grip his shoulders, nails digging in. "I see," she whispered, her breath quickening as his hands roamed her sides, brushing her ribs, then settling on her ass. The layers, they unfold. Her lips grazed his ear, then his jaw, and Zane felt a warmth spread through him. Something dangerous, something he couldn't fight. "Careful," he muttered, his voice rough. "You're making me soft." He pulled back, grabbing her chin and tilting her face up. His thumb brushed her lips, parting them, and he kissed her, deep, possessive, but with a gentleness that was new. She melted into it, her hands sliding to his hips, fingers digging into the skin there, and Zane knew he was done for. The bad guy was still there, but buried under something better, something she'd unearthed. One evening, as they stood on the balcony overlooking the city, the rain had stopped, leaving the air cool and sharp. Zane leaned against the railing, shirtless, his jeans slung low on his hips. Lyra pressed herself against his back, her arms wrapping around his waist, her hands resting on his abs. "Your world, it's chaotic," she said, her lips grazing his neck, sending a shiver down his spine. "Yet you anchor it." He turned, pulling her close, his hands sliding to her hips. "You're making me sound noble, princess." His thumbs brushed the sensitive skin there, and she shivered, her thighs pressing against his. "I'm still the guy who breaks knees for a living." His hand slid to her ass, giving it a firm squeeze, and she gasped, her hands gripping his shoulders. "Noble in your way," she said, her voice soft. She leaned in, her lips brushing his jaw, then his cheek. You protect what's yours. Her fingers slid to his neck, tracing his pulse, then to his lips, parting them slightly. I feel it. Zane's smirk softened, his hand sliding to her back, fingers brushing her spine. Yeah, well, you're mine now. He kissed her, deep, hungry, but with a tenderness he hadn't known he had, and she melted into it, her hands roaming his chest, then his hips. Her ass pressed against his thighs as he pulled her closer, and he felt her breath hitch, her body trembling against his. Yours, she whispered, her lips brushing his ear, then his neck. And you are mine. Her hands slid to his abs, fingers tracing the scars there, and Zane felt his chest tighten, a confession he couldn't voice, but couldn't deny. Something like that, he muttered, his hand sliding to her cheek, brushing the shimmering skin there. He kissed her again, slow, deliberate, tasting the electric hum of her skin, and felt her hands grip his hips, pulling him closer. The city sprawled below, a jungle he'd conquered, but this was a victory he hadn't expected. The redemption came in quiet moments. He stopped barking orders so harshly, let it dead or slide with a warning instead of the beating, and caught himself smiling. Actually smiling, when Lyra brushed past him, her hand grazing his thigh. One night, as they lay on the couch, her head on his chest, her fingers tracing his scars, she looked up at him. You're different, she said, her lips brushing his collarbone, then his neck. Less shadowed. Zane chuckled, his hand sliding to her hip, thumb brushing the curve there. Don't get used to it, princess. But his tone was light, and his other hand brushed her hair, fingers tangling in the silvery strands. You're the one doing this, you know, messing with my head. His lips grazed her cheek, then her jaw, and she shivered, her hands sliding to his abs, fingers digging in. Messing. Lyra tilted her head, her antennae twitching. I enhance. She leaned in, her lips brushing his, soft and tentative, and Zane let her take the lead, for once, knowing he was already hers. Her hands roamed his chest, then his hips, and he pulled her closer, his hands sliding to her ass, squeezing lightly. Enhance, huh? He smirked, kissing her neck, then her cheek. Keep enhancing, then. His hands slid up her thighs, brushing the sensitive skin there, and she gasped, her body arching into his. The bad guy was gone, or at least buried under something better, something she'd built from the ashes. The night stretched on, a dance of trust and redemption, and Zane knew he'd never go back. And that's the epic finale of Zane's redemption. Or is it? Want more of this glowy, gritty goodness? Slam that subscribe button below and join the Badass Chronicles. We've got plenty more alien antics and human heat lined up for you. Don't sleep on this. Hit it now.